from the scholar who first examined it. It can be reliably dated to 1196. This is one of its 5 illustrations, and it shows Jesus being placed in his burial shroud. Mechtilde Fleury-Lemberg is a textile expert who is charged with preserving the fabric of the shroud. She studied these images of Christ in the manuscript and identified a number of features that reappear on the Turin shroud. The most obvious is that the figure on the shroud has the arms crossed and the thumb hidden under the hand.
On the top you see the painting with the corpse laying on a white linen, as one would expect, which is normal, a white linen. And you see the arms crossed, and you see the 4 fingers. The thumb is invisible, is hidden, and that is also a connection. It's also visible, the same on the shroud.
Lemberg is also very aware of the geometric weave of the shroud.
What is more important for a textile historian, as I am, you see painted herringbone pattern. And this herringbone pattern is a typical sign of the shroud of Turin.
Another feature of the cloth are the holes bunched together in an L shape.
These holes here, these L holes, they are on this picture and they are on the shroud 4 times because it was folded in 4 layers. You see here small holes, a little bit bigger, and then here you see the bigger ones.
Oh, I see.
The painter of this picture must have seen the Shroud of Turin. Otherwise it's not possible, because it's exactly the signs which we find also on the shroud in Turin.
If the carbon-14 test is right and the Turin shroud dates to the 14th century, then you wouldn't expect to find the same arrangement of holes in a shroud nearly 2 centuries older. And yet that's exactly what the Pray manuscript shows. So, if the shroud now in Turin was once in Constantinople, what was it doing there? And more importantly, why do we not hear from it again until 1360? Well, this isn't Istanbul, the modern Constantinople, it's Oxford. And I've come here to speak to a man who's made the study of Christian sacred images his life's work. Constantinople had the finest and most prized relics in the world.
This is a piece of the 12th century.
Professor Alexei Lidov has made a study of a rare memoir of a French crusader who hunted down these relics and gives us this intriguing account. It is set in Constantinople in 1204, around 10 years after the date of the Pray manuscript, and it mentions a shroud of Christ displayed in some kind of ceremony, in which the shroud with its figure of Christ was raised up every Friday.
I quote, "Amongst others, there was another of the churches called Our Lady St. Mary of Blacherna, in which was the shroud in which our Lord was wrapped, and which stood up straight every Friday so that the image could be clearly seen on it."
What does he mean by the image or the figure was lifted up?
A kind of rite or a special ritual happened every Friday in the Blacherna church, related to the demonstration of the shroud of Christ. It seems to me very probable that the Constantinopolitan shroud and the shroud of Turin is one and the same piece, because of very rare similarities and this extremely important evidence by Robert de Clary that there was an image of Christ on the shroud.
As for why we don't hear of this shroud again, the crusader Robert de Clary tells us in his memoir that at the end of the Fourth Crusade, when Constantinople was ransacked by French crusaders, no one knew what became of the shroud. But we do know that the Turin shroud's first recorded appearance is 150 years later in France, in the hands of a familiar figure, one Geoffrey de Charnay. Recent research has found that he was married to a direct descendant of one of the leaders of the Fourth Crusade. If a French crusader took the shroud from Constantinople, it would explain why we only hear from it again in the hands of his heirs. But although the shroud disappeared from view for 160 years, Professor Lidov believes a memory of the image on the shroud was preserved in the art of the period. This icon of Christ is known as the Man of Sorrows. It became popular in Constantinople when the shroud disappeared. It has many of the distinctive features of the image on the shroud of Turin, the crossed arms, the hidden thumb. And significantly, it depicts an image of Christ emerging out of a box-like tomb, as if raised up from the dead. Many different versions of it exist. It was clearly a celebration of the resurrection of Jesus, and almost certainly invokes the ritual involving a shroud described by the crusader Robert de Clary. I wonder if its origin might be connected with the loss of the shroud in some way.
I think so. In a way, we may consider this as a kind of compensation
Right.
of this great loss and the commemoration of the presence of the shroud in Constantinople.
The Pray manuscript, the testimony of Robert de Clary, and the Man of Sorrows icon all build a compelling case for the Shroud of Turin being older than the date specified by the carbon-14 test. It's a controversial claim, but it seems to be supported by an intriguing series of features, now clearly revealed by high-definition images of the shroud. When lit from the side, the shroud image all but disappears, and from the shadows emerges another dimension, the cloth's accumulated folds. Watch again what happens when the lighting changes. Notice the horizontal creases the whole width of the cloth. Linen has a kind of memory. It creases, and if it's kept folded for long periods, these creases become permanent and a record of how the cloth has been kept. According to Dr. Jackson, it's data that can be used forensically to link the Man of Sorrows icon to the shrouds of Turin and Constantinople. Dr. Jackson identified a series of fold marks at regular intervals, A, B, C, and D, that reflect the way the cloth was folded during storage. He expected the pattern to repeat itself along the whole cloth. Surprisingly, it doesn't. There is no fold E between the head and the navel. Instead, just below the crossed hands, Jackson found no less than 4 closely packed folds grouped together in what he calls the F block. Finally, the pattern suggested that there should be a fold here by the legs. And sure enough, on close inspection there was, but oddly, it was shallower than the others. Jackson developed a program to simulate all the folds and concluded that they must have come from some kind of device, perhaps for storing the shroud. Jackson looked for clues in the Man of Sorrows icon. Not only did it depict the one area of the shroud that was free of fold marks, but it was invariably shown as something coming out of a box. Perhaps the device that had formed the folds also displayed the shroud in the way described by the crusader Robert de Clary. I've been invited to witness the unveiling of a device designed and built by Jackson's team based on the fold mark evidence and the ceremony witnessed in Constantinople. So what does this machine do, and how does it possibly explain where the fold marks are in the shroud?
Well, all of them were calculated as to exactly where they were. If you remember the F block, the F block is this block here with the 4 folds around it.
Right.
And then we had an interesting problem. We could not explain why there was a missing fold.
Right.
So the solution we came up with was a weighted bar. It does some marvelous things for us. First of all, it keeps the front of the shroud taut, so you always have a good face that doesn't fluff like a sail.
Keeps it taut, yeah.
That's right. And then it also has a tendency to pull this down right on the other side of the F block, which gives us this sharp fold here.
So it answers 2 things is what you're saying. It answers the fact, this pole being here, why there is no fold mark at that point.
Exactly.
And why there is this F block marks here.
That's true.
Okay.
And then we also saw that very shallow fold mark that we saw before. That shallow fold mark is this free hanging fold right there.
This?
Yes, that is correct.
Right. The time has come to decide if this elaborate hypothesis could be true. The Byzantines had a great reputation for creating spectacle and theatrical liturgy. Could this be the image of Christ that was raised up every Friday that Robert de Clary saw in Constantinople? In any other field of historical research, this wealth of evidence, textile, documentary, artistic, and forensic, would be enough to conclude that the shrouds of Turin and Constantinople were one and the same. But the carbon-14 test has created a barrier. The Shroud of Turin cannot be older. Perhaps it's time to ask some questions about carbon-14. I've come to Oxford, site of one of the 3 labs which conducted the landmark tests 20 years ago. Is it possible that the margin of error of plus or minus 65 years was wrong? Should it have been wider? Professor Christopher Ramsey now runs the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit and was present here when the original test was run on the shroud.
I mean, anything is always somewhat provisional. There are always new experiments you can do. Most scientific experiments are only verified by being repeated many times, and then you reckon if you can repeat the experiment and maybe do it in a different way, you get the same answer, you're convinced. With the shroud, you're in a slightly difficult position because obviously you can't go on dating it lots and lots of times. As a scientist, I'm much more interested in getting the right answer than I am in sticking to an answer which we came to before. My own hunch at the moment from the weight of scientific data and other data would be that the shroud is medieval, but I don't necessarily think I will always hold that, and I'm certainly open to inquiries that would indicate otherwise.
There is an anomaly. The evidence from physics is seemingly at odds with that from history. But of course, even if it could be proven beyond doubt that the shrouds of Turin and Constantinople were one and the same, that still wouldn't make it authentic. After all, tradition claims that the Shroud of Turin is nothing less than the burial cloth of Christ. Even the 12th century is still 1100 years after the death of Jesus. But pressure on the reliability of the carbon-14 test has continued to build, with new forensic evidence that places the shroud yet further back in time. It is something known as the Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain. It is reputed to be the face cloth mentioned in the Gospel of John. John says that the disciples entered the tomb of Jesus on the third day after his death, only to find it empty, apart from the burial cloth and the face cloth. We also know from official records in Oviedo that the Sudarium can be accurately dated to the 5th century AD. I've invited to Turin Mark Guskin, an expert on the Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain. His evidence could push the date of the Turin shroud back another 700 years to the 5th century. This is an identical copy of the Sudarium. Its purpose was to trap blood escaping from the corpse as it was taken away for burial. Guskin believes he's identified significant evidence linking the Sudarium to the Shroud of Turin. Guskin already knew that the shroud has real blood. It belongs to the rare group AB. There are also traces of blood shed in life and blood shed in death. And finally, there are the unmistakable traces of blood from a crown of thorns on the front of the head and the back. Guskin believes all three blood features can be found on the Sudarium.
The first is the blood group, okay, which is a relatively rare blood group on the planet. It's the blood group AB, okay, and it's the same blood group of human blood on both cloths. Then there's also the differentiation between life blood, in other words, blood shed in life, and post-mortem blood, which can be clearly differentiated. And again, that coincides on both cloths. And that brings us to what, for me, clinches the whole matter of the cloths being used on the same body. Now, this was blood shed in life, okay, while the man in question was still alive. Now, this blood comes from wounds that were made by some kind of sharp object piercing the skin in this area of the nape of the neck. Okay, perfectly compatible with what has been called since then a crown of thorns. Okay, now if we look at this, we have exactly the same stains in the same area on the Shroud of Turin. Now the actual shape of the stains, if you do an overlay of the two, well, the actual shape, you know, the way the blood flowed coincides on both cloths.
So what you're saying is not only the blood types that are the same, the actual patterns of the blood on both cloths can be matched.
That's right. That's exactly so.
Amazing.
Which has led more than one qualified forensic doctor to say that the only conclusion you can make from that is that both cloths were used on the same body. In other words, it's too much for a simple coincidence.
But so let me understand, what you're saying is that the fact that we know exactly what happened to the Sudarium in its history has huge implications for the shroud, because obviously they both covered the same man.
That's right. And the only place that they could have coincided in time was in Jerusalem, sometime before the 4th or the 5th century. You know, there's no two ways about that. They couldn't have coincided at any given time after that.
Because we know what happens to the
exactly where the Sudarium was all the time.
These very distinctive wounds on the back of the head on the shroud link it to the Sudarium in Jerusalem before 500 AD. The Turin shroud's links with the Shroud of Constantinople pushed its date back nearly 2 centuries. Its links with the Sudarium of Oviedo push it back by another 700 years. To be sure, none of these links necessarily make it the true Shroud of Christ. It might be that it's a 5th century fake. But there is a third shroud, the one described in the Gospels, which wrapped the body of Christ in Jerusalem after his crucifixion. Could the Shroud of Turin be that shroud? That would be the most contentious connection of all, for it would make the date of the Shroud of Turin 1,300 years older than the date indicated by the carbon-14 test. And yet, that's what new findings in Colorado are hinting at. The team studying the Shroud of Turin have identified a number of links to the Shroud of Jerusalem. First-century Jewish burial cloths, as today, had to conform to strict Jewish rules and regulations. First, they had to be linen, uncontaminated by wool. Rebecca Jackson is Jewish herself, and she's found that the cloth used for the Shroud of Turin conforms precisely.
According to Jewish law, you cannot mix linen and wool in the same fabric that will be touched. It's absolutely illegal. And that goes back way back into Egyptian culture, you know, the temple laws of ancient Egypt. And the shroud is definitely linen with some traces of cotton that could have slipped in there. But that's fine.
And that's okay?
That's okay. You can mix linen and cotton forever and ever, but you can't mix linen and wool.
Rebecca Jackson told me of another very specific link with Jewish culture.
This is 1 cubit.
Okay.
And this is 2 cubits.
Okay. Right?
Right.
So let's check it out. That's 2 cubits in width, certainly, right? And across, yeah, that's 1. That's 2. Point there. 3. The shroud's dimensions are in the units used in Jerusalem at the time of Christ, the cubit. What does that suggest to you then?
The whole thing checks out in terms of the measurement
Yeah.
of the shroud in the cubit.
The shroud has many of the hallmarks of a Jewish burial cloth. And Dr. Jackson believes there is evidence that connects the shroud directly to the shroud in the Gospels. The most detailed account of what the disciples saw in the empty tomb is the Gospel of John. He mentions the face cloth, but he also mentions burial cloths in the plural. That must include the shroud that wrapped the corpse, but the plural indicates that there was yet another cloth, and that has puzzled New Testament scholars. Well, Jackson believes he has identified the other cloth in the shroud itself, in a strip of cloth sewn along one side.
This is a transmitted image. It's a transmitted light image. It's an absorption image.
And the shroud is being held up. Jackson owns this backlit image of the shroud taken in 1978. And it shows clearly that the bands of discoloration from the weaving go right through the seam from the main cloth to the strip, showing that it was part of the original cloth, then torn off and then re-sewn back on again. Could this side strip be the missing cloth alluded to in John's Gospel?
Here's the side strip on the shroud.
Right.
Let me just show you. It's essentially the length of the actual shroud itself.
Right.
Okay? So we're going to use this to finish off what I'm proposing to
Explains that movement of the cloth.
So now remember, the bottom of the feet have blood on them.
Right.
And so that has to be held in place. So I'm going to take the bottom part. So let's put a small knot here at the bottom. And we're going to wrap this around, and we're going to make it rather tight because we have to hold the body together.
Exactly. So that's the bit that would have held the knees together.
Yeah. See what this is doing? It's going to hold the legs together, which holds the knees, which is what we observe on the shroud. Now that we've held.
The way the strip fastens the cloth around the body conforms to the way the body is represented on the shroud.
When we look here at the bottom of the chin, notice the disruption that occurs in the cloth. I think that we can see that echoed if we go over here to the negative image.
Okay.
We can see the hair on either side of the face, but when we get down, it looks like the hair, suddenly there's a disruption, at least to my eye, and we see it over here. I think there's also a disruption in the beard. There's something here, and I would submit that that's consistent with what we are inducing by folding on the cloth here.
Jackson's side strip theory could answer the question that's puzzled students of the New Testament. I asked Jackson if he would submit his solution to an expert on John's Gospel in a real first-century tomb in Jerusalem itself. I've arranged for Dr. Jackson to present his theory to Dr. Stephen Need, a New Testament scholar.
So this is just the sort of tomb that's referred to in the Gospels.
Jackson has laid out the body in the tomb, wrapped according to his reconstruction from the shroud, complete with the torn-off side strip tied around it. For accuracy, the sudarium or face cloth that John's Gospel describes is also in position. Then, just before Dr. Need's arrival, the body is removed to leave just the cloths.
It's very striking to come into a real tomb in Jerusalem and to see the clothes lying there like that. It fits in with the Johannine picture, and if that piece of cloth that was torn off at the time of the burial was indeed a separate piece of cloth, that would explain the plural.
If Jackson is right, then this arrangement of burial cloths may be a closer representation of what John's Gospel says the disciples saw when they walked into the tomb on the third day after Jesus' death. The side strip links the Shroud of Turin to the Gospel of John and the 1st century AD. But perhaps the most direct evidence linking the Shroud of Turin to the time of Jesus is an archaeological find made in Jerusalem itself. I've come to the Israel Museum to hear about a discovery made in 1968. Archaeologists unearthed the remains of a victim of Roman crucifixion dating from the time of Jesus. The relevant find was a single heel bone which challenged the way we imagined crucifixion, and the museum has agreed to let me see it. Now, what Ellie has just handed to me is the only evidence that we have of the victim of a crucifixion. The key thing is that this nail did not go through the front of the foot, but through the side of the heel. Grooves on the victim's ulnar bone also show that he was nailed through the wrists. These finds overturn the convention that Jesus was nailed through the front of the feet and his palms. And so they're a benchmark for the true age of the shroud. Crucifixion disappeared along with the Roman Empire. Later artists showed the nails going through the front of the feet and the palms. I would expect a medieval forger to have followed the same convention. But if the method of crucifixion is distinctly Roman, then it's more likely to be from the time of Jesus. I've asked two specialists, Peter Dean, a forensic medical examiner, and Dr. Neil Svensson, an expert on the shroud, to assess whether the type of crucifixion represented on the image conforms to Christian iconography or to Roman methods of execution.
In this area,
there are the wounds you would expect to find from the descriptions in the Gospels. The scourging, for example.